It had all the hallmarks of what would become a new beginning, an exciting chapter in the history of a nation. When pro-democracy protesters took to the streets across multiple Belarusian cities in 2020 amidst a carnival of red and white flags, it looked like this may be the latest episode in a string of successful democratic upheavals which had taken place in several countries of the former Eastern Bloc in the 21st century. But what followed was a brutal suppression and crackdown on all protest movements by the state and the subjugation of a society under the strong-arm tactics of its ruler. We are, of course, talking here about Aleksandr Lukashenko, the last dictator of Europe. So what exactly happens in Belarus, and has anything changed in the years since then? Well, today on Warographics, we thought we'd look at Belarus, the situation on the ground, and what may change in the future. To understand the events of the past few years, it is first necessary to understand just how and under which circumstances did somebody like Aleksandr Lukashenko first come into power. And to do that, it is important to understand the context in which a country like Belarus found itself at the end of the Soviet period. You see, when Lukashenko took control of Belarus in the mid-1990s, the entire former Eastern Bloc was undertaking a great and, in some cases, perilous period of change. The fall of communism had upended the political and social systems in place for decades, as well as the fragile economic balance which had just about held in place until then. The difficulties which accompanied this was none more visible than in Russia, where a coup attempt by Soviet loyalists to preserve the crumbling system was narrowly overcome by Boris Yeltsin's democratically elected government. While political meltdown was avoided, the event did nonetheless mark the beginning of a decade of economic woe in Russia, labeled by historian Andrei Sagankov as the Smuta of the 1990s. The word smuta roughly translates as turmoil, and often refers to a period of great social crisis and lawlessness in early 17th century Russia. Suffice to say, the 1990s in Russia were a period of quite severe hardship. Aside from Russia, other countries in Eastern Europe and Central Asia also found the transition out of communism extremely difficult at this time. Many suffered from lopsided economies, corruption, internal conflicts or other political instability, and difficulties in nation building and the search for a common identity. This was especially true for countries whose population included ethnic groups haphazardly lumped together by Soviet-era population transfers and the redrawing of territorial boundaries. For its part, Belarus seemed to experience a comparatively mild period in the 1990s, and it did so quite simply by deviating as little as possible from the existing communist structure that was in place. And how did it do that? Well, step forward Aleksandr Lukashenko. The full biography of Lukashenko is not really clear. According to his presidential website, he worked as a manager of a state-owned collective farm, or kolkhoz, for several years before beginning his political career in 1990 when he was elected as an MP to the Supreme Council of Belarus. His website goes on to describe him as a politician tough on corruption whose, quote, determination and honesty earned him broad public support. Alternatively, Lukashenko's path to the presidency could be summarized by simply accusing absolutely everyone and anyone of corruption, including the first head of state of independent Belarus, Stanislav Shushkevich, whom he accused of being an American stooge. Whether or not this was true, it did seem to land with the public, and despite being a relative outsider, Lukashenko occupied a comfortable position going into the presidential election in 1994, an election he would go on to win by some margin. Lukashenko's nostalgic take on communism was evident from the outset of his presidency. He had reportedly been the only Belarusian legislature to have voted against his nation's independence as the Soviet Union fell apart in 1991. While Shushkevich had introduced changes designed to enhance Belarusian national identity during his brief tenure as head of state, Lukashenko quickly worked to re-establish close ties with Russia once in power. He signed a friendship and cooperation pact with Russia, restored Russia as the co-official language alongside Belarusian, and even signed a deal that would see the currencies and tax systems of Belarus and Russia merge, although this ultimately did not come into being. The 1994 election remains the only election in the entire post-communist period in Belarus to date seen as fair and democratic, and Lukashenko rapidly consolidated his power in the following years, winning re-election in 2001, 2006, 2010, 2015, and 2020, each one described as illegitimate by observers. It's not surprising, therefore, that Lukashenko has been dubbed Europe's last dictator by the Western press, a title which, curiously, is not one Lukashenko shies away from and has even used when referring to himself at political events in the past. Lukashenko also based his rule over Belarus on the Soviet system by retaining some of its key traits. This included the preservation of symbolic elements such as opulent monuments to Lenin and Karl Marx, adopting a Soviet-style coat of arms, and the introduction of a distinctive red and green flag mirroring that of the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, which has been amusingly described by Cracked.com as a sort of ugly Christmas sweater. Belarus also continued the Soviet system of state-run collective farms, and Lukashenko continued to rely on a state intelligence apparatus to support his rule, an organization which retained its original Soviet-era title, the Belarusian KGB. Now you might be thinking, surely the Belarusian public would reject out of hand the prospect of returning to the backward days of the Soviet system under their new democratic system. But the truth is that the people's feelings, at least in the turbulent years of the early 1990s, were a little more nuanced. You see, despite the Soviet Union always having proclaimed itself as a sort of union of equals based on the emancipation of the proletariat, it was really anything but. Many nations in the USSR fared comparatively better during its existence than others, with some benefiting from privileges coming at the expense of fellow citizens of a different ethnicity. As an example, during the extreme years of Stalinism and his many purges, ethnic groups like the Volga Germans, the Crimean Tatars, the Chechens, and the Ingush were forcibly removed from their homes and shipped off to places like Central Asia, with many of them dying en route or shortly after arrival. Some groups, like the Jews, were disproportionately targeted during the purges, and many others suffered simple day-to-day discrimination under the hierarchical Soviet system. The territories of Kazakhstan and Belarus's neighbor Ukraine suffered devastating famines engineered by Soviet policies, which wiped out millions of people and left large portions of land in either country sparsely populated and massively underdeveloped. Despite the innumerable hardships imposed on all ethnic minorities during this period, the Belarusians under the Soviet system fared slightly better. Unsurprisingly, perhaps given that they shared a lot in common with the Russians, sharing many ethnic origins, a language, and also not having their loyalty to Russian hegemony be questioned in a way that the Ukrainians did. In addition, the Belarusian SSR, as the country was known during the Soviet period, occupied a comfortable place in the history of the Union. It was one of the 4 original constituent republics, alongside Russia, Ukraine, and Transcaucasia. This meant that by 1989 it had spent close to 70 years as part of the USSR. Belarus suffered extreme hardship during the Second World War, being at the epicenter of much of the fighting and losing more than a quarter of its population during the conflict, proportionally more than any other nation in the war. But its post-war experience was brighter than many of its neighboring nations. The territory of the Belarusian SSR actually grew after the war, as Stalin added parts of erstwhile Poland to Belarus, which had previously been surrendered in 1921. The country rapidly industrialized under the USSR's post-war 5-year plans, and the population of the capital city Minsk grew quickly, reaching 1 million people in the early 1970s. The country also became conspicuously more homogenous, its previously large populations of Jews and Germans having been either killed during the war or deported elsewhere. According to economists Michael Aleksandr and Clifford Gaddy, in 1990, as the Soviet Union neared dissolution, the average income in the Belarusian SSR was the 4th highest in the entire USSR, trailing only the industrialized republics of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and significantly ahead of the Georgian, Ukrainian, Armenian, and Moldovan Soviet Socialist republics. Perhaps equally as important, as pointed out by historian David Marples, the Belarusian SSR had prided itself on the incorruptibility of its officials, something which notably contrasted with the well-known excesses of the leadership in Moscow. Pyotr Makarov, a hero of the Second World War and longtime leader of the Belarusian SSR, was celebrated in Belarus for his ability to reform and resistance to corruption, contrasting him with Leonid Brezhnev and other Soviet leaders during the era of stagnation in the 1980s. The fall of the communist system and the rise in corruption cases across the Eastern Bloc had therefore hit Belarusians with a great deal of shock. The regular allegations of corruption made by Lukashenko and his political allies seemed to put the head of state, Stanislav Shushkevich, and Belarus's prime minister, Vyacheslav Kebich, at great odds with mythicized Belarusian leaders of the communist period. In short, when one considers the length of time Belarus spent as part of the USSR, the relative economic stability it experienced, as well as the many difficulties that came with the dissolution of the USSR, it is not a stretch to imagine that many in Belarus may have viewed a return to the days of the Soviet period as a rather attractive proposition. And that is precisely what Aleksandr Lukashenko in 1994 seemed to offer. While not everyone in Belarus bought into his promises nor the appeal of a return to the period, Lukashenko's posturing as a hard-nosed anti-corruption campaigner was enough to see him earn an initial 45% of the votes in Belarus's first-ever presidential election, and to later sweep to victory in the runoff election with 80.6% of the total, putting him far ahead of the second-place finisher, outgoing Prime Minister Václav Klaus, with only 14.2% of the vote. It would be the first and last time a free election would take place in Belarus. For many years, the tale of Lukashenko's grip on Belarus was one which, largely to audiences in the West at least, remained somewhat under the radar. You see, before the protests erupted against Lukashenko in 2020, it could be argued that there simply hadn't been a whole lot to report on in Belarus, and the gaze of the world had been, for a very long time, set firmly elsewhere. Belarus is a geographically rather small country, tucked away on the edge of Europe's eastern flank. With a seemingly popular, stable leader and a rigid political system in place, there had not really been much by way of political developments in Belarus for Western or world media outlets to focus on. No changing of hands politically, no ousted former president vying for power with a younger rival, and no breakaway region seeking to secure its independence and secede. With domestic media tightly controlled by Lukashenko's state apparatus, there hadn't been much room for anyone to report on Belarus at all for much of the late 90s and early 2000s. In the meantime, many other countries of the post-Soviet space were in the process of making a painful and very newsworthy transition towards democracy in the shadow of Russia's leering presence. Countries like Armenia, Georgia, and Ukraine have experienced several political revolutions in the years since the fall of communism. These political ruptures occurred with punchy titles like the Velvet Revolution, Orange Revolution, or Rose Revolution, and featured large-scale demonstrations by civilians, often against pro-Russian governments and political figures. In the case of Georgia and Ukraine, their attempt at moving away from Russia's grip was met with the stifling blow of a military incursion and occupation by Russian forces, along with cyclical Russian interference in domestic political elections. Many of these events received significant attention, with the precarious state of stability, democracy, and independence in Ukraine and Georgia being at the forefront of European political interest in the past few years. Over in Belarus, things remained eerily quiet. The wave of revolutions occurring elsewhere had not spread there, and everything in the country remained business as usual in the early 2000s. In fact, for much of this time, it simply appeared that nothing was really happening there at all. Despite its relatively small geographical size, it was not the country that was so small to have slipped under the radar of global press coverage, such as might have been the case with some of the tiniest republics in the post-Soviet space. At over 9 million people, Belarus's population is still greater than that of any of the Baltic republics, and nearly twice the size of Armenia and Georgia combined, two countries whose post-independence turmoils have been well documented in global press in the early 21st century. Nevertheless, save for the occasional article pointing out its continued frequent use of the death penalty and the suppression of press and political plurality, it would seem that goings-on in Belarus were largely kept hidden under the ironclad grip of Aleksandr Lukashenko for most of the time since his rise to power. But the situation in Belarus was actually far from rosy, and public disquiet at the abuses committed by Lukashenko's government was rapidly brewing. Beginning soon after his election victory, Lukashenko had moved to eliminate any potential rivals to his leadership, including several who'd actively helped to secure his route to power. Viktor Hanchar was Lukashenko's campaign manager during the presidential election, but in 1999, he was abducted and was never seen or heard from again. Emerging Europe reports that he had been executed in custody under orders from Lukashenko himself. Heinaz Kapenka, another ally of Lukashenko during his presidential campaign, died the same year under contested circumstances, supposedly of a brain hemorrhage. Yuri Zakharanka, a military figure who'd been appointed as Minister of the Interior by Lukashenko but later moved to the opposition, was also abducted and disappeared in 1999. Others were still forced abroad into exile, with figures such as Tsar Pazniak, leader of the nationalist Belarusian Popular Front Party and rival to Lukashenko in the 1994 election, receiving political asylum in the United States. And a level of press freedom ranked as among the very worst in the entire world, it was little surprise that Belarus had not been in the news much in the early 21st century. Massive migration flows out of the country continued for much of Belarus's post-independence history, with the Center for Eastern Studies estimating that the country's population in 2023 was a full 1 million people fewer than it had been in 1994 when Lukashenko took office. And on an economic front, although Belarus experienced a jump in growth during the early years of its access to the market economy, reaching a growth in GDP of around 11.4% in 1997, this soon tapered off. By insulating itself against the economic shock of the 90s, Belarus may have been saved from some of the difficulties of the period, but also ultimately avoided the catharsis necessary to transition successfully toward the modern free market. By the 2010s, Belarus's annual rate of economic growth was falling regularly into negative figures. Its economy currently sits as 39th of 48 countries in Europe in GDP per capita, according to figures from the World Bank. And it was at the end of the 2010s that the unshakable image of Lukashenko's hold on Belarus finally ground to an abrupt halt. In 2020, there were a massive series of widespread protests seeking to end the government and authoritarian rule of its mustachioed leader. For arguably the first time, the eyes of the world would be set firmly upon Belarus and the widespread protests against the government occurring there, along with the brutal state crackdown they were met with. By 2020, with the next presidential election scheduled for the month of August, things in Belarus came to a head. With the COVID-19 pandemic ravaging Europe and with Lukashenko's policy being to effectively deny its entire existence, dissatisfaction with Lukashenko in Belarus inched towards boiling point. Sensing the opportunity, the Belarusian opposition decided to make a concerted effort to oppose Lukashenko at the election. Activist Sergei Tishanovsky and opposition politician Viktor Barka began to rally support for democracy, and so Lukashenko had them both arrested on trumped-up charges before the election, rendering them incapable of registering as candidates. Both men have remained in prison ever since then. Nevertheless, Tikhanovsky's wife, Svietlana Tikhanovskaya, registered as a candidate in her husband's place and secured the backing of the Belarusian democratic opposition, including the campaign staff of Viktor Babarika. Tikhanovskaya appeared to have massive popular support, but on the day of the election itself, and following wide-ranging government interference, state authorities announced a landslide victory for Lukashenko, declaring him the winner with over 80% of the vote against only 10% for Tikhanovskaya. The results triggered massive demonstrations across Belarus, with hundreds of thousands of people taking to the streets in Minsk and other Belarusian cities in protest. These protests were responded to with unrestricted brutality by police and state authorities, using tear gas, rubber bullets, water cannons, and other heavy-handed tactics to disperse protesters and round up activists. Mass arrests occurred, followed by reports of torture, alongside several deaths of protesters. A few days after the results were announced, Tikhanovskaya fled to Lithuania, citing concerns for the safety of her children. The European Union did not recognize the election results, calling the election unfree and unfair, and soon implemented the first of a series of sanctions on Belarusian officials, as did the United States and the United Kingdom. And while the protests continued sporadically for around 6 months after the elections, the unrelenting brutality they were met with resulted in their eventual suppression by early 2021. The severe punishments doled out to participants by Lukashenko's siloviki, or strongmen, as well as the long-term detention of protest leaders and opposition figures, eventually caused a scaling down of the protest's size and distribution. The episode resulted in a new wave of immigration from Belarus for those who could do so. The year after the protests saw the biggest population decline in Belarus's history, and according to the Associated Press, as many as 500,000 people left their country for the West in the 3 years after the protests. With the protests put down, one might have expected a return to normality. That is, a return to the relatively little news emanating from Belarus, much has been the case for much of the early 2000s. However, that's not happened. On the one hand, Belarus now has a spotlight permanently trained upon it in the wake of the protests. With opposition figures like Svietlana Tikhanovskaya and others in the Belarusian diaspora active in keeping Belarus's situation in the spotlight, there could be little doubt that the case of Belarus would remain on people's tongues. But there are other reasons why Belarus has not faded into the back of the world's consciousness and Lukashenko towards a sort of temporary rehabilitation, as had become of Syria's Bashar al-Assad. With any prospect of cozy ties with the West off the table, Lukashenko went on to make several moves that not only cemented his status as a pantomime villain, but also ensured Belarus was never far from the headlines in the years since 2020. The 2020s. The mask off. Only a few months after the bloody suppression of the protests, Belarus was once again in the news, this time for the brazen arrest of a journalist traveling aboard a Ryanair flight. The journalist in question was Roman Protasevich, a blogger and critic of Lukashenko, who'd been traveling from Greece to Lithuania with his girlfriend when the plane they were on entered Belarusian airspace. No sooner had it done so than it was forced to land in Minsk due to a warning call of a bomb on board the aircraft made by the Belarusian authorities. The couple were arrested, and Protasevich was later sentenced to 8 years in prison after after having been charged with over 1,500 crimes, including incitement to unrest by a Belarusian court. Though he was, unusually, pardoned shortly thereafter, some Belarusian opposition figures suspecting this was due to his having surrendered important information about fellow activists to the authorities. Nonetheless, the story of the plane's diversion and Protasevich's arrest received massive press coverage and fierce criticism from Western outlets, and resulted in a total ban by the EU on all of its flights using Belarusian airspace, as well as a corresponding ban on the use of EU airspace and airports for Belarusian carriers, followed up on by a host of economic and financial sanctions against state industries and individuals associated with Lukashenko's regime. But Lukashenko didn't stop there. With the mask now off, Belarus came to the forefront of international headlines again in 2021 due to a migration crisis on its western frontier with Poland. With many Belarusian opposition figures and dissidents having found refuge in the European Union and especially in Poland, Lukashenko had threatened to, quote, flood the EU with migrants and with drugs. Flights to Belarus from Damascus, Baghdad, and Istanbul suddenly sprang up as Belarus began enticing thousands of migrants and asylum seekers to its territory under the promise of a quick and simple route across the border into the EU. Sure enough, streams of desperate migrants arrived in Belarus and were given passage to cross the EU's border by Belarusian authorities. But when Poland took a hard line on the arrivals and attempted to shunt them back across the border, a vicious cycle of back and forth began between the Polish and the Belarusian authorities, as Belarus refused to take the migrants back and would often try to shunt them back towards Poland once more. Many reports of brutality by Belarusian police and military would later abound, with the migrants often caught in the middle. Further still, since 2022, Lukashenko has offered support to Russia in its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Part of the initial invasion occurred from inside Belarus, which offered Russian land forces the quickest route towards the Ukrainian capital Kyiv. Lukashenko further allowed Russian missile attacks to be launched from Belarusian soil upon Ukraine, and even offered a haven to displaced Wagner fighters in the wake of their failed rebellion in 2023. So while Lukashenko may have survived the threat to his regime, there has been no return to the status quo of before. Instead, Belarus has joined Russia in becoming a sort of international pariah, becoming the target of massive international criticism and sanctions, in addition to the strife. Still, despite the visible threat to his reign, it would appear that Aleksandr Lukashenko became one of the few post-Soviet leaders to survive an attempted revolution with his political system intact. However, none of this means that Lukashenko can afford to rest easy. If anything, his problems have only multiplied. On an external front, there remains the question of the Belarusian opposition in exile, which has worked to undermine the state in a number of ways. Figures such as Svetlana Shishkanaskaya and Zanon Pazniak have continued to work to put pressure on the Belarusian president from afar. In addition, an exile group known by the acronym BYPOL has attempted an even more direct path by openly claiming to be plotting a coup to overthrow Lukashenko, as documented by Politico in February 2024. The opposition movement claims to be training a number of fighters to take part in a potential conflict against the regime, as well as to be sabotaging the Russian war effort against Ukraine by attacking supply depots and military aircraft with drones. However, the events of 2020 have left Lukashenko vulnerable from a different angle. He is now totally dependent on his fickle friend in Moscow for both political and economic survival. Even before 2020, Belarus's economy depended heavily on Russia. Russia was Belarus's biggest trading partner, responsible for almost half of its trade in 2020. The country's outdated economic system meant it was heavily dependent on loans from Russia, with Deutsche Welle reporting that Russia owned around 38% of its neighbors' national debt. These issues have since become worse, with Belarus's second largest trading partner, the EU, having largely curtailed its trading arrangements with Belarus following the events of 2020 and 2021. In addition, Lukashenko's regime has benefited from a supply of energy, gas and crude oil from Russia at below market prices, an arrangement which Putin has reportedly ordered to be phased out in 2024 in order to force Belarus into an even deeper union with Russia. Without Russian crude oil, Belarus risks the loss of billions of dollars of its own oil output, a potentially crippling blow to its already weak economy. Then there's the threat of a simple Russian invasion, should they not toe the line and do as Big Brother says. Putin has displayed in the past his willingness to forego former allies should it suit him. Despite Lukashenko's saber-rattling, Belarus's army is thought to be relatively weak, relying on outdated Soviet equipment and military doctrines, and with active personnel of only a little over 60,000. Unlike Ukraine, with a much larger military force and the active support of the West, Belarus would not be in a position to defend itself, something Lukashenko should be wary about, but also whoever takes over the reins from him in the near future.